In this video, we're going to do two things. We're going to talk about delegates a little bit, and we're also going to make some changes to the main menu movie. Because one of the issues we're having with the main menu is that when you load the menu up, even though you don't see the saved games initially unless you click the load game button, they actually exist. They're just not visual. Their alpha's been turned down to 0, so they're kind of hiding. And even though there's ways you can do this in Flash to make things disappear and things like that. Like I said, this isn't heavily Flash intensive. This is Unrealscript based. So what we want to do is we want to do it through Unrealscript to make those buttons not work. So what we're going to do is we're going to create a variable bool called bLoadMenuLoaded, and that's going to be our decider of whether or not our load menu is actually visual or not. And then down in our on load game button pressed function, we're going to add if bLoadMenuLoaded is false, then we're going to set bLoadMenuLoaded to true, otherwise set it to false. So if it's true, it sets to false. If it's false, it sets to true. This gets run only when the person clicks on the load button. So if they click it the first time, it sets to true. If they click it the second time, it sets it back to false because that's when they're turning it off. Then down in set save game choice, we just want to do a check to make sure that it is it is not equal to false. Because if it's true, if it is loaded, then we want to let the buttons work. If it's not, then we don't want to let them work. So that's pretty much what this code does. If bLoadMenuLoaded is not equal to false, then go ahead and set the save game choice and run the set save game function. And that pretty much will fix the main menu issue for the most part. Yeah, sure. I mean, if the player clicks on load game and then clicks on high scores, he could still click on the save game thing. But like I said, this is just pretty much to show how it's done. Usually in Flash, you'd want to find a way to make those buttons not exist until the right moment. But at the same time, you need to also make sure that Unrealscript is able to function properly by loading the proper button information too. So you have to kind of have this very good equilibrium, so to speak, I guess, when it comes between the two systems or two softwares working together. All right, so now I want to talk about delegates a little bit. Uh, Delegates are functions basically that are used to change dynamically. Throughout our code, we've been using functions a lot, obviously, and one of the things that we normally do is when we get to a part where we want certain code to run, we normally call in a function. Well, not you right at this point, because this game is so simple in many ways that you don't have to worry so much about delegates. But because we use one in with the arrays, I thought I'd bring it up because it could be helpful for you all to know in the future as well. Um, Say, for instance, you have a certain situation where you call on a specific function that runs a certain type of code. For instance, let's say when the player drinks a potion, it it's going to make him stronger or whatever. It makes him faster. And that code gets called on at a specific point in the game. It could be, uh, you know, maybe even on a timer that checks every 10 seconds to see, the situation of the player. Whatever. It just gets called at a certain point in the game. Well, say for instance you don't want that code to happen every single time. Say the player had leveled up to a point where now he no longer drinks the potion. Now when he drinks the potion, it doesn't make him as strong because he's so high leveled that that potion doesn't have the same effect on him anymore. It was it was like a newbie potion, so to speak, and it only helped the weaker players out. It wasn't really meant for stronger players. And you don't want that code to run anymore. You want it to run different code, but you still want it to run something. You're not just like turning it off completely. Well, what you can do is you can do a couple things. One, you can do a switch statement, which we've used before, which finds like the case situation. We've used that inside of our Puzz enemy class inside of our controller when we were setting our information. Uh, and you know you could do that, but the downside of that is, say there's a lot of situations. Say there's more than 5 or 6 situations, or even more. You might be growing your code to the point where it's getting out of hand, and you want to you want to keep it to a certain point. So like if we go inside of our Puzz AI controller, I'll show you a quick switch statement that we've used. Right here at the top, what we've done is inside of function initialize, we've been calling on a case situation where AI type gets casted in, and then if the case is melee mob or the case is shooter mob, we set AI info to a specific thing. Well, say this was more code. Say there's a lot of code to this, and 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 we're going to go back to the potion situation now. Uh, say a switch statement would just be too big and too much in order to really be relevant. It almost seems, a problem more than help at this point. Well, that's where delegates can come in. What you can do then is instead of doing a switch statement, you can actually change the code on the fly. So, for instance, let's go back to our situation with the potion. Say the player gets a certain code up till level 10, and then that code's supposed to change from 11 to 20, and then change from 21 to 30, and 31 to 40, and so on and so forth up the list. And the player hits level 11. What you could do is you could do a simple check in this case where it says if or when the player hits this level, uh, that function no longer is equal to what it originally was, but instead it's now equal to this situation. So now whenever that function gets called on, um, you don't have to actually look at the switch statement. Now it just has different code, and it will keep that code throughout the entire game. So it needs to only be set one time and never needs to be run again. So that's the good side, is that it's less of an impact on the game itself, because you're not running a switch statement every single time this code gets called. And on top of it, it allows it to dynamically change, which kind of what a switch statement sort of does, is allows it to change uh, on the fly based off of the situation. So you kind of get best of both worlds. You get more speed out of your game, and you also get less code, and you also get the ability to be dynamic. Now, there can be numerous examples of how you could really utilize a delegate, but no example will be better than seeing in a situation where you need the code to run every single tick. So, say you did need code that runs every single tick, which usually you don't want to do, but let's say you had a situation where you needed to do this. There was no other option. You just had to have it run every single tick. Well, this is where a delegate could be great, because at this point, the code is getting called every single time. So we're going to go inside of our player controller class, and we're going to go into an event called player tick, which is pretty much the tick version of player controller. We're going to do super.playerTick because we want to keep that code that's already in there. And we're going to call a function called testMe. Now, if this was a normal function, testMe would basically just do the exact same thing over and over again, never change. Okay, but it's not. This is a delegate. So at the top here we have delegate testMe. So we say we say it's a delegate by declaring it. And then we say log I am running some really cool stuff right now. So whatever code you'd put in there. It could be particle changes, whatever. Okay, so now you got a whole bunch of code running every tick. Even like I said, it's not the best thing to do, but if it's the only resort, it's the only resort. So you have a whole bunch of nice code running at every tick. Well, let's say, for instance, that code isn't working anymore. You don't want that code to do what it's been doing because something's changed. The player's done something different, and you don't want that particle running anymore. You want a different particle running. Maybe he's picked up a superpower ability or something. I don't know. Whatever the reason is, you don't want that code to be running. Well, you can actually change this code on the fly dynamically without having to do a whole bunch of switch statements and things like that. And to do that, what you can do is you create a function called change test me, or you call it whatever you want, but we called it change test me code, which basically means you're changing the test code. And we're going to pass in a delegate of type test me called test delegate. And then we're going to set test me to equal to that test delegate. So it's almost like test me is no longer a function, but it's become a variable because you're now assigning it to another function. So you're changing its code here. So by setting test me to whatever we pass in, we'll then change this function into whatever that function is. Now, we're passing in a delegate test me class, but as long as it shares the exact same parameters, as long as the function shares the exact same parameters, and it shares the exact same return value, you can pass it in. So even if, for instance, we could actually use create start menu, and we could call on change test me code and pass in create start menu, and then test me now becomes create start menu. Now that would be a horrible idea because it's in the tick, so you would be creating these start menu over and over again, and resetting it constantly every tick. So obviously that's a horrible idea. But I'm just saying because it shares the exact same parameters as test me, the original delegate, because it has no parameters and it has no return value, just like test me has no return value. You could set this function to test me. So as long as it has the same parameters and the same return value, you can set anything to the delegate. Okay, so now we have this code. So nothing's really happening except for when you start the game up, it'll scream at you, I am running some really cool stuff right now, constantly every single tick. Now let's say you walk inside of a portal and you don't want it to run that code anymore. So let's go inside a puz volume portal, and inside event touch, we're going to call that function change test me code. Back here, remember how we have change test me code? We're going to call that function. And inside of that, we're going to pass in a function called inside volume code. Notice we don't need parentheses. We just call it what the name of the function is. And because it's inside of our puz player controller, we need to grab that. So we do puz pc.change test me code, and then we pass in the function inside volume code. And then we have a function, and it's not a delegate function, it's just a regular good old function, and the function's called inside volume code. And in that, we're going to set the log to say I'm running something entirely different now. And so what's going to happen is when the player walks inside of the portal, inside of an event touch gets called, it's going to call on change test me code. It's going to pass this function's code in and change it on the fly to test me. So test me is no longer going to run log, I'm running some really cool stuff right now. It's going to run, I'm running something entirely different now. And it's going to do it every single tick, even after you leave the portal, because we never reset it. We keep the code there. So you enter the portal, and it changes the code, and for the rest of the game, it's going to run that code instead. And that's the really neat thing about delegates, is because now you've dynamically changed the code. Now, let's say you didn't want to do it this way. Let's say you're like, I don't want to figure out delegates. I don't care about delegates. Well, if you wanted the exact same situation to happen, if you wanted puz volume portal to actually happen, what would you have to do? Well, for one, if you wanted to actually make sure that you were knowing you're inside the volume, you would have to have some sort of boolean going of some sort, because you'd have to find out whether the volume was being checked. So one way is you could, inside player tick, you could do a for each iterator and find all touching actors. That's one option you could possibly do for the pawn. However, that would probably be very intensive in your code, and you wouldn't want to do that. Another way is you could create a boolean here inside the player controller, and then inside a puz volume, you would set that boolean, kind of like what we do here with b in portal. You would set that volume, or that boolean inside of the volume, and then back here inside of your player tick, you would say if test me dot b in puz volume portal is equal to true, then you would want to then create a separate function inside your player controller and then tell it to run that function instead. But you can and then say if it's false, you would run the test me function instead. Now that's fine and dandy if you just have one thing, one situation where you want to change. But let's say you had multiple situations. Let's say you had multiple volumes, multiple situations where you wanted to change that code. Well, at this point, your player tick's going to start to grow. Your switch statement could be, you would probably no longer use an if statement because it would become almost, well, you might even have to use if statements. You probably have to use a cluster of if or multiple if statements where you'd say if it equals b in puzzle, or b in volume portal, or whatever, and then it might say be in this portal, be in that portal, whatever the situation is. You'd have all these if statements, or you might eventually find your way into a switch statement to do this code. But otherwise, look how simple this was. All you really did was you called on one function, you passed in the function you created, and it does all the work for you. So it's a really nice way to learn, and I strongly suggest you learn it. Now, you won't need to use delegates all the time, and matter of fact, they don't get used very often. But when you do need to use them, it's really important that you have an idea of how to use them, because then you can avoid a lot of intensive coding, and you can actually make your game run a little bit smoother as well.